Thank you everybody for coming today. Yes, today I'm going to talk about the history of horses on the plains, the Intermountain regions, kind of where we're at. I don't claim to be a horseman. There's plenty of people out in this audience that pretty much know a lot more about horses than I do, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolutionary history of horses, what we can see from archaeology, and how horses were here and then came to be here again. And it's quite a fascinating story, really. And this talk is going to combine paleontology, archaeology, and history. But first, I'd like to read you a little vignette. Sometime in the early 1700s, somewhere along the rolling foothills of Montana, a man named Shaved Head lay in hiding, staring into the distance at a group of very big dogs. To the west lay the peaks of the Rockies and the Continental Divide. To the east, the short grass plains stretching for hundreds of miles. Shaved Head's usual haunts were some distance to the north, in what is now Saskatchewan. But together with a group of Blackfeet comrades, he had run and walked south for several days, leading a war party in search of the people who had come from across the mountains to hunt buffalo, probably the Shoshone Indians. At last he had discovered one of their camps, but in it stood a number of these strange big dogs. The Blackfeet had dogs, of course. They used them to haul skin lodges, cooking pots, and utensils whenever they moved camp. But these dogs were different from any Shaved Head had ever seen. They were as tall as a man and more the size of elk, except they seemed to have lost their horns. Still, they couldn't be elk, for they obviously were slaves to the Snake people, just as dogs were slaves to the Blackfeet. Shaved Head managed to steal a few of the animals, but when the warriors tried to mount them, the creatures began walking and the men quickly jumped off. Cautiously, they led the animals home, where everybody in the band gathered around and marveled. At first, people tried putting ropes on the animals' backs, but that made them jump. After a time, a woman said, "Let's put a travois on one of them, just like we do on our small dogs." So they made a travois and attached it to one of the gentler animals. He didn't kick or jump. Then the people led him around with the travois attached. Finally, a woman mounted the animal and rode it. In the years after, they called these creatures Hano Kamita, or elk dogs. So this is an oral account from the Blackfeet that was passed down many, many generations. And obviously it talks about the first time they saw horses. Other groups in the region, in the plains, have similar kinds of stories. But it's very interesting to think about, if you're going through your daily routine, how many of you all of a sudden see a brand new creature, a brand new animal? We can travel to exotic places and see those things, but these native groups are all of a sudden confronted with these big dogs, these medicine dogs, and how they took to them and adapted with them, and how culturally central they came to these plains groups is very important. But so we'll talk more about that later, but that's just kind of gives you an introduction to, what was going on here when the horses came back. So the horse is a New World animal, meaning when I say New World, I'm talking about North, South, Central America versus Old World, Asia, Europe, Africa. They evolved here. So this is just kind of a general schematic of horse evolution. Basically, the takeaways from this is, they evolved here basically kind of in this region, more or less, the Intermountain region. But branches of horses, and there were many, many branches and types of horses that went extinct. We see many, many different species through time. But beginning, in the Eocene, which is approximately about 55 million years ago, we start seeing the ancestors of what we can definitively call the ancestors of the horse. And that would be what's known as Heracitherium. So another name, it was first called Eohippus, and hippus meaning horse in Greek, called dawn horse, meaning it was the first species that we can definitively say was the ancestor of the horse. So these animals were very small. I mean, you wouldn't look anything like the horses we see today. They were basically about the size of a cat or a small dog. And they also had multiple toes, 4 toes in the front, 3 in the back. So this is just another example that shows you basically the size of one of these things. So very small. These were the ancestors of the small, furry mammal, rodent-like creatures that survived the the Cretaceous, Paleogene extinctions. When the meteorite hit. This is about 10 million years after that. We start seeing these, and just to give you an idea, it just so happens that I happen to have a part of a Heraclitherium mandible that was found in Utah in the Uinta Basin. And if people want to see this, I can just pass it around, take a look at it, and it gives you an idea of how small these things were. But of course, the evolutionary trend in horses was to become larger. With a lot of mammals were this way, and we're talking about as we go up in time. We can fast forward even to about 5 million years ago, at the start of what we call the Pliocene epoch. We start seeing animals that really look like we recognize them for what as the ancestors of horses. Size-wise, they weren't quite as big as probably what mostly we see now with domestication, but you would definitely know that these were horses. And another trend you see, and this is kind of a really early kind of evolutionary schematic that kind of shows the fact that their teeth kind of evolved into being dedicated grazing animals versus Heraclitherium being more of a browser, which means browsing animals can generally eat grass and or browse in the form of shrubs, trees, things like that. More dedicated grazing animals are pretty much eat grasses, and they definitely have different teeth morphologies versus the flat tooth grinding of the grazer versus the more crown tooth of a browser. So initially they kind of started out with browsing, but this also falls in line with the development of the great grasslands we see out here, the Great Plains and things like that, which came about, kind of co-evolved with these animals. And of course, they became more cursoid or more adapted to running through time. And that process also involved losing those toes, either through, they become kind of, morphed back into the other bones, or they just kind of go away. But in the end, you have the one-toed animal, the horse, with the angle of the foot or the toes was conducive to being more cursoid or able to run. And I guess talking about toes, horses are a little unique because they are odd-toed animals, which means, they have 1 or 3 or 5 or whatever, but horses evolved to basically walk on the one toe, versus they're even-toed animals called arteriodactyls, which are like most deer, elk, sheep. But the evolution to walk on one toe is fairly unique. It's the only, the species of equus is the only species that does this. This is just another slide that kind of shows you general trends in this evolution of the horse. This is more genetic based, so based on the divergence in the DNA, you can kind of see when certain species split off from other species. But the main thing I kind of take away from this is there were a lot of species of horses, especially in the Pleistocene. And when I say the Pleistocene, I'm talking about 2.6 million years ago till about 13,000 years ago. So basically, right when the end of the Pleistocene was when people were first known to be in the New World, on this continent. And some examples of other odd-toed ungulates or perissodactyls. The onager, which is found in basically in Asia, Africa. Tapir is, and the other thing I guess I should mention is like the tapir and the rhinoceros have 3 toes, so they're not the same as the horse. And of course, the onager, the wild ass, Przewalski's horse, and the zebra all have a single toe. Przewalski's horse is basically what they think the horses might have looked like at the end of the Pleistocene. It's kind of a Middle Europe, Eurasian kind of horse. So, back to the New World. As a lot of you probably know, at the end of the Pleistocene, probably the last 10,000 years of the Pleistocene, a lot of large mammals went extinct that lived here in this region. You can look at this painting and you can say, well, but you know, mammoths were gone, short-faced bears gone, American lions gone, this kind of antelope, Saiga antelope's gone, dire wolves are gone, camels gone, and horses are gone by the end of the Pleistocene. And that was due probably to a combination of climate change and or human hunting, potentially. I mean, that's a little debatable, but there is people that think that that's about the time that humans colonized the New World, and they came over here and found all these naive fauna that had never seen humans before, and just, you know, had stuff that was easily hunted. And when you're talking about large mammals, you're talking about animals that have kind of slow reproductive rates, things like that. And then you couple that with the climate change that was going on. Things were getting a little warmer. There was more pronounced seasons, and a lot of this classic steppe land, pasture, grassland stuff was going away that a lot of these animals had adapted to. And again, talking about the evolution of the horse, I made the point a couple times that there were a lot of different species during the Pleistocene, and even today, they're still finding new ones. And I know paleontology has issues with sample sizes. If you find a new skull and it looks different than everything else, well, is that a new species, or is that just variability within a known species? So sometimes it's tough given the small samples, but based on genetic work and some morphological comparisons, like the shapes of the cannon bones, the lower limb bones, they were determined even as recent as 2017 that there's a new horse species that was out there running around in the Pleistocene. And then another issue is the fact that some of these early horse types were not, shall I say, they weren't legitimate. This was a horse species called Laurentius that was described in 1913 based on a cranium and a mandible that was found in the Kansas River near Lawrence. But subsequent analysis has shown that this was not a Pleistocene horse. People aware, you know what bit wear is on a horse, or on a horse's teeth? And it's basically the wear that comes from wearing a bridle bit. Usually it's on the front, like the P2 lower. Well, this supposed Pleistocene horse has bit wear. And then they dated the crania and the mandible and came up with different dates. So it's like two different animals that are modern, basically. And you know what? it's tough, and I guess the point is it's by the end of the Pleistocene, they do look, they're basically the horses we see today. There was a lot of different species, but again, this is just kind of a cautionary tale. So, at the end of the Pleistocene, there is overlap with when humans showed up in the New World. I mean, there's debate over exactly when that was, but we can say for sure, at least about 14,000 years ago, people had made their way, you know, into the interior of the Americas. People were here, and they were hunting horses. And this is, you know, kind of the first interaction you see. Prior to their going extinct here in the New World, there was some overlap with humans. And this is a place called Wally's Beach in Alberta, Canada. And this upper picture is a horse vertebral column, basically with kind of a hammer stone there. They have some stone tools. So this is one instance of where a horse was being at least hunted and or butchered, at least butchered. Maybe it was scavenged, but they were, you know, and they're large animals. It's a good source of meat. Another kind of very interesting thing about this site is that the radiocarbon dates on it tend to be a touch earlier than you see with the later, what we call Clovis occupation, where people were hunting mammoths and things like that, most commonly. Whether that means that horses kind of maybe died out a little sooner. It's, I guess, food for thought. Another instance of horse utilization. So this is known as the Mahaffey cache, and it was basically found in the town of Boulder, Colorado. While I was there, my advisor was contacted by this gentleman, Pat Mahaffey, and he said, I had some landscapers out basically digging a koi pond in my yard, and they popped out all these. Do you have any idea what might be going on here? And so we have, you know, these giant bifaces and, you know, chipstone bifaces like this. There's big flakes, and all this material comes from like northwestern Colorado, southwestern Wyoming, and then along kind of up in the Front Range. But looking at the size and the way some of this stuff is flaked, my professor, Doug Bamforth, said, well, it looks like to be like a Clovis cache, basically. So it's like a 13,000-year-old cache where somebody had dug a hole, put these tools in to come back later if they needed these to use, and never did. So, but it lacks what we call diagnostic artifacts, which are, you know, the finely shaped points and things like that tell us, you know, that's a Clovis point. They're very distinctive. So another way to get at this is he had some of these pieces tested for protein residue. So if you used it to butcher something, it leaves a trace of protein that lasts for many thousands of years, particularly in the right environments. So you test it against known proteins from known species, and if you get a match, you know, it can tell you that, you know, it was used on a certain animal. So lo and behold, you know, this piece here was used to butcher a horse. You know, one of these pieces was used to butcher a bear, one of these pieces was used to butcher a camel. So when you see that it was used to butcher a horse and a camel, animals that are no longer here, that are extinct, you get that time scale. Yes, it's probably a Clovis cache because they're the only people here we know that did that. But anyway, this is another example of a tool being used to butcher horses. And when we get back over into the old world, so over into Europe and Asia, we see a long history of horses being hunted. Also a long history of them being portrayed in this, you know, beautiful rock art, paintings from Lascaux Cave and Chauvet Cave in France. Yeah, for many 50, 70,000 years, these animals were hunted over there. At about 8 to 10,000 years, we start seeing sites in Central Asia, kind of Europe, Asia, kind of borderlands where you see a lot of horse bones. You start seeing a lot of horse bones that have evidence of being butchered, but you also see a lot of horse bones that were from selective aged animals, and things that make us think that they're probably starting to domesticate them. So the first step for domestication was basically to keep them for food, you know, like we would cattle or sheep. So they were probably herded, kept for food, and this was probably, you know, 8,000 years ago or so in these regions. It's not till about 5,000 years ago that you start seeing actual evidence of the things we talk about, bit wear, evidence in graves in this region of people that, you know, are buried with the accoutrements of riding, you know, tack, things like that. We start seeing they actually had gotten to the point where they figured out they could ride these animals. And these were people that lived out on the steppe regions, basically kind of big pastoralists to begin with. They had probably domesticated goats and things like that previously, so, you know, they knew that animals could go there, could be domesticated. So that's kind of where the horse becomes, you know, very central to these cultures and central to entwined with human history. And from there, you know, these groups and this idea and wheels and things like that spread out. They spread west across Europe. You know, they spread into northern Europe, and also down into the Middle East and places where we see, you know, very advanced civilizations that are kind of based a lot of their warfare and their prowess on the use of horses, chariot-mounted warfare. There's some debate whether the horse was first used to pull a wagon or a chariot, or it was ridden first. But it's a question that may not ever be answerable given the evidence. But we know that later times they were certainly used in this manner. So now we're kind of moving up into, let's say, the 1500s. We've kind of followed horses over the Bering Land Bridge, you know, through Asia, and then through to Western Europe. And now these Western European countries, Portugal, Spain, England, have developed the technology to be able to sail great distances. With, you know, the sailing technology has become such that by late 1400s, early 1500s, they can make these transatlantic voyages. And they start coming in, of course, Christopher Columbus and discovering the New World and attempting to colonize the New World because of the perceived riches. And of course, in this encounter, they come across the native indigenous groups that have been there. But they also, particularly, you know, talking about in the southeast and the southwest of what is now the United States, talking about the Spanish entradas, the Spanish conquistadors coming, bringing horses, you know, the Spanish barbs. Expeditions such as Hernan de Soto came through the American Southeast, Hernan Cortez came through with the Incas, Francisco Coronado came up into the Great Plains. All these groups brought fairly substantial horse herds with them. And these were probably the first introduction, well, were the first introduction a lot of groups saw of these animals. But also at this time, you know, they were associated with the Spanish, and the Spanish didn't treat the native groups so well at times. I mean, they were constantly wanting supplies from them and things like that, and end up, you know, there's some acts of brutality. So horses being associated with the Spanish at first, there's accounts of them just actually being killed. You know, that's something associated with the hated Spanish, so I'm going to kill it. And these early expeditions were also thought to be the impetus for the first wild horses, or the first opportunity for natives to adopt horses or become equestrian. But this has largely been refuted because the Spanish, most of their expeditions were, they brought very few mares. They brought mostly stallions. These were war horses. So there was very little opportunity for, to establish any kind of breeding viable populations based on what the Spanish brought initially. And also, there's very few accounts that any of them strayed. There's an early account from Coronado where they're going across to Llano Estacado, like West Texas, where it's so flat. And they come upon a bunch of bison who they called cattle at the time because they just didn't have a word for bison or buffalo. And the bison spooked and carried away a bunch of their horses with them. There's something like that, but anyway. So, yeah, the real start, I guess, you could say, is when, especially in the Southwest, in what is New Mexico, the Spanish, they founded towns like Santa Fe, Albuquerque, these areas, El Paso in Texas, and they started trying to, raise livestock and farm there, and bring the Indians under their tutelage, and proselytize and, introduce them to Christianity. But these were probably the events where the native groups in that area were exposed to horses, as herders, as things like that helped, at these missions. Also, they were able to just look and see what, how the Spanish were dealing with these animals, how they rode them, how they trained them, and, just by mimicry and things like that, were really able to understand the use of these animals. So, if you think about that happening in the Southwest, and then, in 1680, there was what was known as the Pueblo Revolt, 1680, when a group of, basically a bunch of Puebloan Indians, they all combined forces and ejected the Spanish out of the Southwest. So this was thought to be kind of a watershed event for the development of equestrianism, the availability of horses to native groups. So they kicked the Spanish out for like a decade. They have access to all their animals. They have the knowledge and the training, of how to use these animals. And then these things start filtering out. They start moving. They start spreading out over the plains. This is basically a classic model that this came up with, and you can see that this is about Santa Fe region. But these animals spread, and they spread fairly quickly. And the thinking is, I've always been interested in the development of equestrianism, but it's something that happened really fast. These were also people that were used to being around large animals and knew how large animals behaved. I mean, they've been hunting bison, deer, and elk for thousands of years. They knew how, to deal with this stuff. So at this point, yeah, you start seeing them spread out, in the late 1600s, and even up, and these dates are rough, but they're probably roughly correct. By the 1750, they're already up into the northern plains, where people like Shaved Head, see them. And the way that some of these dates are arrived at, I guess, just to dig into it a little bit, is you're looking at historic accounts of when these groups were first seen with horses. And a lot of it, it happened ahead of European, permanent presence in an area. So horses probably preceded, trade goods preceded beads, things like that. Like, Shaved Head and some of these interior groups like the Blackfeet, probably the Crow, they probably saw horses before they saw Europeans or Euro-Americans. But you look at these early dates of when they were seen with these certain groups, and you can kind of build a model based on that. A real famous account was in in the Northern Rockies in 1787 and 1788, a trader named David Thompson. He wintered with a group of Blackfeet, and amongst them was an 80-year-old Cree man named Sakamapi. And talking to Sakamapi, he had stories of when they had first seen horses. So doing a little math in the 1720s, 1730s, they went south and they basically were fighting against Shoshone groups that were coming up north, kind of similar to Shaved Head's story where they're coming out to hunt bison. But initially, you know, they saw these people had horses, but they didn't use them in warfare. They basically rode them to the battle, got off, formed a line with a bunch of giant shields, and shot, you know, arrows at each other for a while, and then that was that. So they didn't initially, you know, see the utility in actually using them as part of warfare. I mean, that was to come, of course. We all know the stories about how great of a light cavalry some of these Indian groups were. So this was a horse found in Wyoming near Flaming Gorge, and I think this is a really interesting example of, you know, maybe what we're talking about with not recognizing it for what it could be, or thinking it's, you know, hey, that's associated with some people I don't like, but this was a young horse. Probably 2 years old or less, complete skeleton. I think they found it during some road construction, but it was basically kind of laid out, buried there, along with 3 coyote skulls were placed with it. This, you know, the reasoning significance, you know, your thoughts are as good as mine. You know, it lends itself to some kind of ideological, religious kind of sacrifice on this, you know, this animal that maybe whoever did this had not really seen one of these things before. The other thing that lends itself to what I was kind of talking about is this thing was just hacked up pretty badly. I mean, like all these indicate like blows, and that would be like a femur bone, like an upper leg bone. This is just a close-up showing one of the axe cuts, but it goes beyond just butchering marks. It's kind of like mutilation marks. So it's very interesting, and the thing roughly dates probably to the late 1600s, so would have been pretty early, you know, if we're up this far north to see something like this. But it's a really interesting example of, you know, maybe these things weren't initially appreciated, or they were associated with bad things. So when we end up with, you know, these horses that are spread out amongst the plains, and by, you know, the late 1700s, probably early 1800s, there were very substantial just wild horse populations, or feral horse populations, throughout the plains, basically. It's one thing I've always read. Historians, or some historians, and some of the early models like to think that, you know, horses couldn't really survive in the northern plains. I mean, say north of here. So there was this constant trade from the southern plains to the tribes in the northern plains throughout the 1700s, 1800s to replenish these herds. And, you know, that may be the case with broke horses or things like that, but I mean, you can go to the Red Desert today and see the horses survive pretty well in pretty marginal places. I mean, and this, you know, this is 90% of their evolutionary history is out here. I mean, they take to it. So there were a lot of wild horses around. Just to get, you know, a couple examples of how they were captured. You know, there's a general description. They were just basically roped in some cases. Another, of course, obvious way to capture them, like I said, is to raid somebody else's horses and take them, which became a very huge part of these plains groups' lifeways. Young men trying to make their, build up wealth and, get wives and things like that, took part in raids. And often the objective was to get somebody else's horses. There's accounts of Blackfoot raiders from northern Montana, southern, down on the Arkansas River, southern Colorado, just so a group of young men looking for horses. The Crow went down that far, things like that. It was very important. But and again, the thing is they were, a broke horse is either to deal with than a wild horse. And another thing is that, I tend to talk about horses a lot, but mules are very important too. A mule was actually worth more than a horse, for obvious reasons, when it came to trading and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, they would lasso them. But another way that, we see evidence of even in Wyoming is they would run them into corrals. Occasionally, I mean, there's some evidence from the Kiowa and the Southern Plains. They're actually running them into corrals. There's evidence of, preference for wild horses for certain things, like for, to hunt buffalo, and the classic sense of the buffalo runner, the horse that you run alongside the buffalo and you put the arrows in it and move on to the next one. Well, there's a Cheyenne guy who says, they preferred wild horses for that because they were out amongst the bison the whole time. They wouldn't be scared of them. Like they had to ride up alongside them when they're hunting them. So they were preferred for buffalo or bison runners. So there are examples of actual horse traps that we can still see. This particular is just a map from one that's in northern Colorado. There's a big tradition in kind of where southwestern Wyoming, kind of northeast Colorado. There's horse trapping going on, at least up into the 60s, up until the Horse and Burro Act, and even a little bit past that. But this is kind of the classic trap where you're just, you build a corral, you have wing walls that you kind of herd them into the corral. A lot of these things were facing, so the horses would be running into them, they'd be going downwind. And again, just another example. And when you kind of look at it on a Google Earth aerial, you can see, they're taking advantage of some of the topography too, to run them up, up the top of a ridge. I've seen these traps where they were, there's one little spot where you can go up on this isolated butte that's got 20-foot cliffs all around it, and there's an old brush fence, and some kind of a corral, taking advantage of the drop-offs and stuff. Just another example, kind of showing with multiple wing walls, so you could run them in depending on, probably wind or where the horses were or something like that. But it was quite important. Accounts of, the Crow having, in the 1830s, having, a herd of 10,000 horses to a village, things like that. And this is a little different example of, I think, some kind of facilities made to contain horses. This is, again, in southwest Wyoming, a place called Upper Powder Spring. But this red dotted line is kind of the remains of a brush fence that stretched a couple miles, but it basically stretches all around this little basin here. And then there's a spring here. So if this was all complete, you could envision kind of just basically like a pasture with water that they were holding horses in. I mean, that's kind of the consensus. This is an area where there are a lot of horses today, but this is also an area where historically it was kind of this borderland between the Cheyenne the Shoshone to the north and the Ute to the south. So, I mean, thinking about even meeting to trade horses or raiders raiding into somebody else's territory and grabbing horses, and this is kind of a stopover. But yeah, there's just examples of this kind of, they just took juniper logs, brush, laid them along there. Quite an investment in work, actually. This is just gives you an idea what was kind of fenced in. And another clue is there's a ton of images of horses and riders and stuff in that area. A lot of this is charcoal, probably fairly late, early 1800s kind of stuff. That's happens to be a painting, but yeah, it lends itself to this. This was some kind of center that was related to horses and horse capture and or horse trading. It's a very, very interesting place. And then another interesting kind of aspect of horse adoption or the development of equestrianism is you see the early advent of the native use of armored horses. So they would take horses and just drape them with thick leather armor, probably bison hide, bison robes, as a way to protect them from lances, arrows, things like that. This is a hide painting from the 1720s that was done in New Mexico, and basically these raiders have armored horses. You can kind of see that triangular shaped draping over the horses, and they're attacking some kind of fortified village. Some of the interpretations are raiding for slaves or just raiding, but anyway, that's an example of the use of hides. In rock art, this is kind of some stuff from the plains. There's some stuff in Wyoming too, but again, these armored horses that were used in battle. And an example I guess I've seen is down in along the South Platte in northern Colorado. It's kind of hard to see, but until you line it. But so this, they think this didn't last very long. This was kind of, maybe it was a bit of mimicry of the Spanish armor, but making use of native, materials, bison robes. But probably by the 1750s or so, this stuff has kind of fell out of favor. And the thinking is that they probably got enough guns by that point to defeat this to some degree. And but this would have been effective against lances and bows and arrows. And again, it shows how valuable these animals were, and actually how adapted these native groups became to just fighting horseback. And when we talk about guns and horses, they're kind of, in a lot of people's minds, I guess, can be a bit intertwined as far as they were super important trade goods in a sense. And this is really hard to see, I apologize, but a guy named Frank Sequoia came up with a model where he talks about the origins of horses kind of in the Santa Fe area, and then the origins of guns. And these are the kind of the frontiers at certain times, 1675. The guns are spreading from the east and from the northeast, and then the horses are spreading kind of from the south, and how they overlap. And basically the takeaway is the Spanish didn't really trade guns. They forbade it. They had a totally different relationship with native groups. They wanted to convert them to Christianity. Make them part of the workforce in a sense. French traders, English traders to the north, the French, they basically married in, became part of kind of this trading culture they certainly traded guns and stuff. So when you think about guns coming this way and then the horses coming that way, the first groups that got horses, like say the Comanche in the South, you know, they became pretty powerful. The first groups in the North, which generally are thought to be the Shoshone, which are they are related to the Comanche. They share the same ancestry. The Comanche at some point broke off from a group up here and went south, but they maintain relationships and trading relationships, and they basically speak the same dialect. There's a slight difference. But so the Comanche in the South were following horses to the Shoshone, and in the 1700s, like this was Shoshone country. Up to the Yellowstone was Shoshone country. I mean, they took horses and it allowed them to, you know, expand their territory. You know, they were out hunting on the plains. I mean, there's talk of them even, you know, the Missouri River. There were Shoshone groups. I mean, they had spread out that far based on being kind of the first group with these horses in any numbers. But then, they're kind of in the middle. There's groups in between them and the traders. These other groups start getting guns. And I guess the simple way to put it is the gun trumps the horse, in a sense. So these groups that are armed start, like the Blackfoot and like the Lakotas and some of these other groups. So they push them back into kind of where they are now once they get the gun. So there's kind of that interplay. And finally, I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the considerations. You know, once you become an equestrian group, this is some ethnographic data that was compiled by a guy named Louis Binford. But I mean, it's pretty obvious, it's pretty intuitive that yes, you're going to increase your mobility. Yes, you're going to be able to carry a lot more stuff. And this just kind of really illustrates that. I mean, people are moving a lot more. The distances increase. I mean, by a lot. And part of it is too is when you have horse herds, you've got to think about things like forage for your horses. There's certain places that you probably end up during the year. I mean, the classic, you know, wintering along the riparian zone, along these big rivers, you know, to support these horses. I mean, it's something you wouldn't necessarily have to think about if you were just pedestrian. You know, if it was just your water, you know, water for you, you had to think about, or your food. So that probably adds to the amount of movement they had. And then finally talking about hunting, you know, it basically revolutionized hunting in a way, I guess. But especially bison, I guess I'm thinking about bison a lot when I'm talking about these things, because the plains groups and a lot of intermountain groups, bison was the most important resource. They had, you know, prehistorically did develop very efficient ways to kill bison, running them off cliffs, running them into pounds. But with the horse, you know, some aspects of that became easier. Just the individual hunter could go out, you know, and with a bow and arrow or a lance and knock off a few bison, hopefully, versus needing a whole community to get together to like build a drive, build a corral, run them into the corral, you know. And in that aspect, it also, you know, bleeds into the culture of these groups where, you know, individualistic kind of acts became more important, community became maybe a little less important, because one person on a horse was able to do a lot more than one person on the ground. So when we think about hunting, you know, just that individualistic pursuit, the ease of hunting, and this was also at a time when, in the early 1800s, when bison robes and things like that were very valuable trade items. So the ability to kill a lot of bison easily could lead to great wealth. Classic Cheyenne, you know, kind of plains groups became pretty wealthy. I mean, there was a time, and just eating that diet, living that lifestyle, there was a time in the 1840s when the Cheyenne were probably the tallest group of people in the world. You know, they averaged like 6 feet. but they were, you know, they were hunting, they were killing a lot of bison. They were manufacturing bison robes, you know, dressing the hides, trading that, getting trade goods. I mean, it was a brief window of very, you know, a very successful, wealthy kind of lifestyle, but it did work, and the horse was an integral part of that. I mean, horses were able to carry more meat back to camp. You're able to pack more stuff around. You see teepees getting larger because they could pack a 1,000-pound teepee, you know, teepee covering. But you also see interesting things too, like polygamy, more wives to dress these enormous amounts of hides that are needed to keep this stuff going. I mean, it's the cultural changes and the societal changes are very interesting, but the horse is pretty central to that. And I guess with that, I will ask if anybody has any questions.
Is there any evidence in rock art from the Clovis area, from before the first extinction?
Of horses?
Yeah.
Or, you know, there's very little evidence of rock art that we think is that old. Right. It just, I think in a general sense, it just didn't last on the rock faces. There's some carved bone that people think might be like a carved mammoth, which, you know, might be an indication of that they were carving stuff of extinct animals. But yeah, you just don't see it here. Like you have those caves in Europe where stuff's just lasted in those environments, but it's just different out here. Yes.
Any signs that they tried to domesticate the horse, if just for meat at that time?
Nothing that I've seen definitively, but you know, the record from that period is the archaeological record. You know, the artifacts from that period, the bones there's just not a lot of them, so it's not out of the question. I mean, especially once you've seen how you can domesticate certain animals, you know, you tend to try it on other things, but there's no evidence of it for sure. But I guess I'm saying it'd be really hard to know, but it's definitely not out of the question. Because they do think that, you know, horse domestication took place independently in different places, you know, a little bit. You know, it was something that different groups in different places saw could, you know, happen.
Where, you had a slide of, I think it was 4 rock art drawings, and I think you indicated it was Southwest Wyoming. Where was that?
It would be in between Baggs, Wyoming, and kind of Rock Springs. I don't know, along just north of Little Snake River, called Powder Wash area. Yes.
Since there was a fairly rapid expansion of the horse during the 100-year period of the 1500s, 1600s, and since the Spaniards brought rangeless stallions, where did the mares come from?
Well, after the initial, you know, expeditions, and they developed, you know, missions throughout the Southwest. Part of the mission, what you want to call the encomienda system, was, you know, they developed farms and had livestock and stuff like that. So they'd have breeding populations, you know, probably starting not too far after these initial conquests, you know, or initial expeditions. Into the, you know, late 1500s, early 1600s. Talking, you know, Santa Fe was founded in 1610. They were, they basically were trying to farm and, you know, raise a viable kind of farming economy there, and part of that was having like horses and cattle. So that's where they think a lot of that stuff came initially.
Yeah. You can aid some of that rock art by pre-horse was the size of the shields that they carried. If they're in rock art, then post-horse, it became smaller.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. that story about the Shoshone fight and the Blackfoot, you know, they had the big, because they weren't fighting on horseback yet, so they had the big giant shields they kind of walked up. But yeah, once they kind of commit to fighting off a horse, you see shields getting smaller. You also see the bows getting smaller. You know, go to that kind of shorter bow because it's just easier to manipulate. Yes.
This will show my ignorance, but I have to ask this question. You said that the horse evolved in the Americas,
Yes.
but then they all left and went to Asia, and then they had to come back by the Europeans?
Yep. Yeah.
So
That's-
there were no horses that continued to evolve here in the Americas?
No, they went extinct about at least, you know, 13,000 years ago, 12,500 years ago. They went extinct along with, you know, the mammoth and the mastodon and the camel and all those animals. So yeah, at various times, and I try to make that as clear, that they had migrated, you know, west across like the Bering Land Bridge. It's an interesting thing because actually, as well, the camel evolved here too, and it migrated west across the Bering Land Bridge and went extinct here, and then developed into all the the camel species we see in the old world. But yeah, the horse basically kind of, in a sense, went around the world.
So, Cody, I've heard and read about animals that are big enough to actually manipulate the landscape. Mammoths were one of them, and bison was certainly one of them. When horses came back, they probably were too. You're talking about managing 10,000 horse herds per village. Wow, that's an amazing impact on the landscape. And I read an account from Kearney days of these streams not having any cottonwoods on them.
Yep.
Because they fed horses on down cotton. Is that?
That's true. Yeah, there are a lot of accounts that was kind of their winter food was cottonwood bark, and you'd see places just stripped clean. And yeah, and it was one of those things where there was maybe too much of a good thing in a sense that yeah, they were definitely having impacts on. Like yeah, I can't even imagine what and these are accounts, you got to take them with a grain of salt, but at least probably these really wealthy equestrian tribes probably did have thousands of horses per village unit, and yeah, the impact of that is got to be wintering somewhere. And yeah, there's just you hear that a lot. You're absolutely right. Like these riparian zones were just stripped.
No wonder they kept moving.
Yeah, and they definitely moving, and like you see the increasing amount of movements in that ethnographic data. But yeah, there's some pretty good work about how the reintroduction of the horse in the southern plains and people like the Comanche who had these massive herds really impacted the environment and did themselves wrong, or hurt their own economy that way. Unintended consequences, of course, but yeah, it definitely happened when you introduce another species that's big and going to eat that much. And there's already kind of this balance with, bison and deer and elk and these other animals. Population packing, I guess it's called. Yes.
Now, you're referring to horses, and in the vernacular of equestrians, did not most of those Indian horses fall under the status of pony? Cow ponies, hunting ponies, the definition of a horse starting at 14.2, pardon me, and most of the Indian horses were dimensionally smaller than that.
Okay,
Come to
sure.
think of it, so was Mongolian horses.
Yeah.
Or ponies.
No, that's correct. I just use the general terminology. I'm sorry if I'm using it wrong, but Yeah, no, you're right. The pony would be the better term, because they were generally smaller.
Not much smaller, just enough.
Enough.
Get used to jumping on the horse.
Thank you, Dr. Newton. There's probably still some donuts back there. We really appreciate you coming out, and hope to see you at some more future events. Hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.